"You are not allowed to speak to me like that in front of everyone." The voice cut through the crowded civic plaza like a sharp line drawn in the air, stopping conversations mid-sentence and pulling attention from every direction as dozens of people slowly turned their heads toward the source of tension unfolding near the main steps of the municipal building. Officer Daniel Brooks stood in full uniform under the bright afternoon sun, his posture firm, his expression controlled but visibly sharpened by authority, as if the presence of an audience only reinforced his need to maintain command over the situation. In front of him stood Alicia Carter, a black woman in her mid-30s, dressed in simple professional attire, holding a folder close to her chest as if it was the only physical boundary between her and the weight of the moment now forming around her. She had arrived expecting a routine civic clarification, something procedural, something contained within normal administrative flow, but instead she found herself at the center of a growing public scene she did not ask for. Around them, the crowd had expanded without intention, people slowing their walk, others pausing entirely, phones beginning to rise subtly but without full commitment, as if no one was yet sure whether this moment would become something worth capturing or simply pass like any other disagreement. Alicia's expression remained steady, though her eyes reflected a controlled awareness that the situation was shifting beyond private interaction into public perception. Officer Brooks spoke again, his tone still measured but now carrying a sharper edge, emphasizing procedure, compliance, and expectation in a way that made the surrounding silence feel heavier. Alicia attempted to respond calmly, her voice steady but not raised, explaining her position in clear terms that reflected preparation rather than emotion, yet each sentence seemed to dissolve into the space between them without acknowledgement. The crowd's attention tightened, not loud, not reactive, but observant in a way that changed the atmosphere from casual public space to silent witness. A few steps away, a second officer shifted slightly, maintaining distance but reinforcing presence, adding to the layered structure of authority surrounding the interaction. Alicia adjusted her stance subtly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, simply grounding herself as the moment extended longer than expected, each second stretching the gap between being heard and being dismissed. Officer Brooks glanced briefly toward the growing number of bystanders, and something in his posture reinforced itself, as if awareness of being watched was not a moderating force but a reinforcing one. Alicia noticed that shift, even if no one else did, and continued speaking with controlled clarity, her words steady despite the pressure forming around her. The plaza remained bright, the air still, but the emotional temperature had already changed, and somewhere within the crowd, an unseen phone quietly began recording what no one yet fully understood would not stay contained within this moment. The tension that had begun forming in the civic plaza did not disappear as the conversation continued, instead it settled deeper into the space like an invisible weight that influenced every small movement around the steps of the municipal building. Officer Daniel Brooks maintained his position directly facing Alicia Carter, his stance unchanged, his presence steady in a way that suggested confidence in procedural authority rather than openness to reconsideration. His voice remained controlled, but now carried a sharper precision, as if each sentence was being carefully shaped not only for Alicia but also for the growing audience around them. Alicia, still holding her folder close to her chest, listened carefully and responded with calm restraint, choosing words that remained factual and measured, even as the environment around her subtly shifted in perception. The crowd had grown slightly denser, with more people slowing their movement, forming a loose semicircle that framed the interaction without fully entering it. Several individuals now held their phones at chest level or slightly higher, not yet fully committed to recording but clearly aware that the moment had become something beyond a simple public exchange. "Officer." Brooks glanced briefly across the crowd again, his awareness of the audience becoming more apparent, and his tone adjusted in response, becoming more structured, more formal, as if reinforcing the boundaries of his role under observation. Alicia noticed this shift and remained composed, her posture steady, her voice consistent, continuing to clarify her situation without escalation or deviation from her original intent. A second officer stood a few feet behind and to the side, maintaining a supportive but restrained presence, occasionally shifting weight from one foot to the other, signaling attention without direct involvement in the verbal exchange. The civic building behind them reflected sunlight across its glass and stone surfaces, creating a bright, almost indifferent backdrop to the increasingly focused human tension in front of it. The crowd remained quiet, but the silence was no longer neutral, it carried expectation, as if everyone present was unconsciously waiting to see whether the interaction would resolve smoothly or shift into something more significant. Alicia adjusted her grip on the folder slightly, not out of agitation but as a grounding gesture, keeping her focus on communication. Officer Brooks responded again, referencing procedural expectations in a way that reinforced structure over dialogue, and for a moment the space between them felt less like a conversation and more like parallel statements existing without convergence. A faint movement near the edge of the crowd suggested someone had begun recording more deliberately, though still discreetly, angling their phone to avoid drawing attention. Alicia did not acknowledge this, her focus remaining on clarity and resolution, but the atmosphere continued to evolve around that silent action. Officer Brooks remained firm, but the presence of witnesses subtly influenced the rhythm of his delivery, creating small pauses that did not exist earlier. The plaza remained bright and open, yet the emotional atmosphere had become concentrated, as if the entire scene had narrowed into a single point of attention where words, posture, and perception were all beginning to carry greater weight than intended. A shift in the atmosphere became noticeable not through any single dramatic action, but through a collective change in attention among the growing crowd surrounding the civic steps. What had begun as a structured civic interaction now carried an undercurrent of observation that subtly altered every exchange between Officer Daniel Brooks and Alicia Carter. Brooks maintained his authoritative posture, yet his responses began to show a slightly more deliberate pacing, as if accounting for the fact that each word was now being absorbed not only by Alicia but by dozens of silent witnesses. Alicia remained composed, her expression steady, though there was a quiet intensity in her focus that suggested she was carefully measuring each response rather than reacting emotionally. The folder she held against her chest was no longer just a document holder but a symbolic anchor in the middle of a widening public moment. The crowd had grown more defined in structure, no longer simply passers-by but a semi-organized audience shaped by curiosity and hesitation. Several individuals now stood closer together, forming clusters where quiet exchanges occurred in low tones, while others held their phones at angles that suggested they were recording without fully acknowledging it aloud. Officer Brooks, sensing the increased attention, adjusted his stance slightly, straightening his shoulders and reinforcing his procedural tone. His language became more formal, referencing guidelines and expectations in a way that emphasized structure over interpretation. Alicia responded without raising her voice, maintaining a calm consistency that contrasted with the increasing rigidity in the officer's delivery. The second officer present remained a step behind, observing both the interaction and the crowd, occasionally scanning the perimeter as if ensuring that nothing else would disrupt the controlled environment. The civic building behind them reflected light across the scene, its clean architectural lines standing in contrast to the increasingly complex emotional dynamics unfolding at its base. Alicia briefly paused between responses, not out of uncertainty but as a deliberate choice to maintain clarity, and that pause was noticed by several onlookers who interpreted it in different ways. The silence between spoken words became more significant than the words themselves, carrying tension that neither side explicitly acknowledged. Officer Brooks continued to emphasize procedural correctness, but the rhythm of his speech subtly shifted as if the presence of witnesses was introducing an additional layer of pressure into his communication. Alicia's calm demeanor remained unchanged, yet her eyes reflected a heightened awareness of the crowd's attention, particularly as more phones were now visibly directed toward the interaction. A bystander near the outer edge of the semicircle adjusted their position to gain a clearer view, inadvertently signaling to others that something important was developing. The crowd's silence deepened, not out of confusion but anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for a turning point that had not yet arrived but was already being felt. Officer Brooks paused briefly mid-sentence, a fraction longer than before, then continued with reinforced authority, as though reasserting control over a situation that was gradually becoming shared rather than contained. Alicia remained steady, her presence calm but increasingly central to the focus of the entire plaza, while the unseen act of recording among the crowd quietly ensured that every detail of the moment was being preserved beyond what any single participant could control. A subtle but decisive shift occurred in the atmosphere as the interaction reached a point where silence itself began to carry more meaning than speech. Officer Daniel Brooks maintained his structured stance, yet the increasing attention from the surrounding crowd began to influence the rhythm of his communication in ways that were difficult to ignore. His voice remained controlled, but there was now a slightly more pronounced emphasis on procedural language, as if reinforcing boundaries that were no longer defined only by authority but also by observation. Alicia Carter remained composed, her posture steady, her expression calm but increasingly attentive to the evolving dynamics around her. She did not step forward or backward, maintaining a neutral position that suggested both patience and awareness, as though she understood that the moment was no longer confined to the exchange between two individuals. The crowd had now fully transitioned from passive observers into active witnesses, though still largely silent, their presence shaping the emotional structure of the scene. Several phones were now clearly visible at varying heights, no longer hidden or tentative, indicating that documentation of the moment had become more intentional. Officer Brooks briefly scanned the semicircle of onlookers, his awareness of being recorded now fully integrated into his demeanor, subtly altering the cadence of his speech. Alicia's responses remained consistent, measured, and clear, but each pause between her sentences carried increased weight as the audience continued to interpret the situation in real time. The second officer shifted slightly closer to Brooks, maintaining a supportive position while also observing the expanding crowd perimeter, ensuring that no additional disruptions emerged from the growing attention. The civic building behind them reflected the late afternoon light in sharp geometric patterns, its structured architecture contrasting with the increasingly fluid emotional tension below. A faint murmur passed through a small cluster of onlookers, quickly subdued, but enough to signal that collective interpretation of the event was beginning to take shape. Officer Brooks continued to reference procedural expectations, yet his tone now carried a subtle rigidity, as if attempting to preserve control in an environment that was no longer entirely predictable. Alicia's gaze briefly moved across the crowd before returning to the officer, a controlled acknowledgement of the broader audience now shaping the moment. The silence was no longer uniform, it had layers, shifting between individuals who were recording, those who were simply watching, and those who were quietly processing what they were witnessing. A bystander near the front adjusted their stance to stabilize their phone recording, and that small motion triggered a ripple of similar adjustments among others. Officer Brooks paused slightly longer than before between statements, and in that pause the power dynamics of the interaction became more visible, not through escalation but through observation. Alicia remained steady, her presence unchanged, but now undeniably central to the collective focus of the plaza. The interaction had evolved beyond its initial boundaries, becoming a shared public moment shaped equally by those directly involved and those silently capturing every second of it. A noticeable shift settled over the plaza as the interaction approached a point where procedural language no longer felt sufficient to contain the emotional weight of what was unfolding. Officer Daniel Brooks stood firmly in place, his posture unchanged, yet the rhythm of his authority began to show subtle signs of adaptation under sustained observation. His voice remained controlled, but each statement now carried a slightly more deliberate structure, as if every word was being filtered not only through professional discipline but also through the awareness of an expanding audience. Alicia Carter maintained her composed stance, her expression steady and focused, with her attention divided between the officer and the crowd that had now fully formed into a collective presence around the steps of the civic building. The folder in her hands remained close, not as a shield but as a grounding point, reinforcing her calm consistency amid a situation that had grown increasingly public in nature. Around them, the semicircle of onlookers had become more defined, no longer shifting loosely but holding their positions with intention. Phones were now clearly visible across multiple points in the crowd, held at stable angles, indicating that recording had transitioned from incidental to deliberate. The atmosphere carried a quiet intensity, not driven by noise but by sustained attention that made every pause in speech feel extended and significant. Officer Brooks briefly adjusted his stance, shifting weight slightly as he continued referencing procedural expectations, yet the repetition of formal language now seemed to interact with the silence in a more complex way than before. Alicia responded with the same measured clarity, her voice consistent and steady, maintaining factual precision without escalation. The second officer remained positioned just behind Brooks, scanning the edges of the crowd with controlled movements, ensuring situational awareness while not intervening directly in the exchange. The civic building's facade reflected the late daylight in sharp contrasts of light and shadow, reinforcing the visual stillness of the environment against the increasing psychological tension at its center. A few individuals in the crowd subtly repositioned themselves, not breaking the silence but adjusting their perspective, signaling a shared recognition that the moment had shifted beyond ordinary interaction. Officer Brooks paused slightly longer between statements, and those pauses began to carry interpretive weight for the audience, becoming as significant as the spoken words themselves. Alicia's gaze briefly moved across the gathered observers, acknowledging their presence without acknowledging their judgment, before returning to the officer with steady focus. The crowd's silence deepened further, becoming layered with anticipation and interpretation, as if each person was processing the same unfolding event through different internal frameworks. A faint movement at the edge of the semicircle suggested continued recording activity, discreet but persistent, reinforcing the permanence of the moment beyond its immediate setting. Officer Brooks continued speaking, but the structure of his delivery now existed within a shared space of attention that subtly influenced its tone and pacing. Alicia remained centered within that space, her composure unchanged, but her presence increasingly defining the emotional focal point of the plaza as the interaction moved toward an unresolved but increasingly consequential state. A quiet but decisive change began to emerge in the plaza as the interaction approached a point where observation itself started to influence the outcome more than any spoken exchange. Officer Daniel Brooks remained in position, his posture still firm and controlled, but the rhythm of his authority now carried subtle signs of constraint as the presence of sustained recording and concentrated attention from the crowd became impossible to ignore. His language remained procedural, yet each statement now seemed carefully measured, as if shaped not only by professional discipline but also by an awareness that the moment was no longer confined to the immediate participants. Alicia Carter maintained her steady composure, her expression calm and focused, continuing to hold her folder close as a grounding presence while the environment around her had fully transitioned into a shared public record being formed in real time. The crowd, once loosely arranged, now stood in a more stable formation, with multiple individuals clearly holding their phones in recording positions, their attention fixed and unwavering. The silence that had filled the space was no longer passive, it had become an active form of witness, amplifying even the smallest shifts in tone or posture. Officer Brooks briefly adjusted his stance, a controlled movement that suggested awareness of the increasing weight of documentation surrounding the encounter. His voice continued to reference procedural expectations, but the cadence now carried a heightened awareness of being preserved beyond the moment itself. Alicia responded with consistent clarity, her tone unchanged, maintaining a calm precision that contrasted with the increasingly rigid structure of the officer's delivery. The second officer remained slightly behind and to the side, scanning the perimeter with measured attention, ensuring situational stability while avoiding direct interruption. Behind them, the civic building's reflective surfaces caught the late daylight, casting geometric patterns across the steps that seemed indifferent to the emotional intensity unfolding below. Within the crowd, a subtle but important development occurred as one individual lowered their phone briefly, then raised it again at a more deliberate angle, indicating a shift from casual observation to intentional documentation. This small action appeared to influence others nearby, who adjusted their own position slightly, reinforcing the sense that the moment was being collectively preserved, rather than individually observed. Officer Brooks continued speaking, but a faint pause began to appear between phrases, a pause that carried interpretive weight as it stretched slightly longer than before. Alicia's gaze moved briefly across the audience, acknowledging their presence without breaking her composure, before returning to the officer with steady focus. The crowd's silence deepened further, becoming layered with anticipation, as if the absence of reaction itself had become part of the unfolding narrative. At the edge of the semicircle, a bystander made a subtle movement consistent with sending or sharing a recording, though it remained discreet and unconfirmed within the immediate visual field. That action, however, introduced a new dimension to the moment, suggesting that the interaction was no longer contained within the plaza but beginning to extend beyond it in real time. Officer Brooks maintained his position, but the structure of his authority now existed within a broader awareness of external observation that subtly influenced his pacing and emphasis. Alicia remained centered and composed, her presence calm but increasingly defining the focal point of the entire scene as the interaction reached a stage where what was being witnessed could no longer be separated from what was being recorded and shared beyond the immediate space. A significant turning point began to form not through any visible confrontation, but through the quiet acceleration of information beyond the immediate boundaries of the civic plaza. Officer Daniel Brooks remained in position at the base of the municipal steps, his posture still structured and controlled, yet the subtle rigidity in his stance now carried a different weight as the awareness of being continuously recorded became impossible to ignore. Around him, the crowd maintained its formation, phones still raised, faces still focused, but the energy of the moment had shifted from passive witnessing to something more irreversible, as if the scene was no longer just being observed but actively documented into a record that would exist beyond the physical space. Alicia Carter remained composed at the center of it all. Her expression steady, her posture unchanged, holding her folder with the same grounded calm that had carried her through every escalation so far. The silence that surrounded her was no longer neutral, it now felt layered with consequence, as if every person present understood that what they were witnessing had already moved beyond the point of simple resolution. Officer Brooks briefly adjusted his position, a controlled movement that suggested an attempt to maintain procedural focus, but his attention increasingly reflected an awareness that the situation was no longer contained within direct interaction. The second officer shifted slightly closer, maintaining operational presence while scanning both the crowd and the surrounding perimeter with measured precision, indicating that the situation was now being treated with heightened awareness. Within the crowd, several individuals subtly changed their grip on their phones, stabilizing their recordings, and in doing so reinforcing the collective certainty that the moment was being preserved in full detail. A faint ripple of motion passed through the group as one person appeared to send or transmit a recording, and although no words were spoken, the action carried a visible sense of escalation beyond the plaza itself. Officer Brooks noticed the sustained attention and briefly paused between statements, his procedural language continuing but now interrupted by longer intervals that reflected an increasing awareness of external scrutiny. Alicia's gaze remained steady, occasionally shifting across the audience without breaking composure, acknowledging the presence of witnesses without altering her calm demeanor. The civic building behind them stood unchanged, its reflective surface capturing fragments of the scene in fragmented light, reinforcing the contrast between institutional structure and human tension unfolding below. In the distance, subtle changes in movement among the crowd suggested that the recording was no longer isolated, as multiple devices now appeared to be synchronizing their focus on the same central interaction. Officer Brooks continued to speak, but his delivery now existed within a broader context that extended beyond verbal exchange, as if each word was being absorbed into a system of observation that he could no longer fully control. Alicia remained still and composed, her presence increasingly defining the emotional center of the plaza, while the collective awareness among the crowd continued to grow. Without any dramatic shift in action, the situation reached a new phase where the documentation of the moment itself had become the dominant force, signaling that what was unfolding was no longer confined to a public interaction but was already transitioning into something that would extend far beyond the steps of the civic building. A final and irreversible shift in the atmosphere unfolded across the civic plaza as the interaction reached a stage where presence, observation, and documentation had fully merged into a single collective experience. Officer Daniel Brooks stood at the base of the municipal steps, his posture still upright and controlled, yet the subtle tension in his stance reflected an awareness that the situation was no longer contained within the boundaries of direct authority. Every movement around him now carried additional weight, shaped not only by those physically present but by the expanding reach of recorded evidence being captured from multiple angles. Alicia Carter remained centered in the space, her expression calm and steady, maintaining the same composed posture she had held since the beginning of the exchange, her presence now functioning as the emotional anchor of a moment that had grown far beyond its initial scope. The crowd had become fully engaged as silent witnesses, their phones held steadily, their attention fixed, and their collective focus transforming the plaza into a living record of the event. Officer Brooks continued speaking in procedural terms, but his delivery now carried longer pauses, as if each statement was being measured against an unseen awareness of how it would be interpreted beyond the immediate audience. The second officer remained positioned slightly behind, scanning the perimeter with controlled precision, maintaining situational awareness while avoiding disruption of the unfolding exchange. Within the crowd, subtle movements indicated that recordings were being stabilized, adjusted, and in some cases transmitted, suggesting that the moment was no longer localized but actively extending outward in real time. Alicia briefly shifted her gaze across the gathered observers, acknowledging their presence without altering her calm demeanor, reinforcing her composure as the central stabilizing point of the interaction. The civic building behind them remained unchanged, its reflective surfaces catching fragmented light that contrasted sharply with the increasing psychological intensity below. A faint ripple of motion passed through the outer edge of the crowd, where one individual appeared to finalize a recording action, signaling that documentation of the event had reached a broader distribution phase. Officer Brooks paused slightly longer than before between statements, and in that extended silence the structure of authority appeared to intersect with a growing awareness of accountability shaped by observation. Alicia remained still, her posture unchanged, her focus steady, embodying a sense of restraint that contrasted with the increasingly complex environment surrounding her. The crowd's silence was no longer passive, it had become an active form of presence, reinforcing every moment of the exchange with collective attention. Without any abrupt change in action or movement, the situation reached a settled but definitive threshold, where what had begun as a localized civic interaction had fully transitioned into a documented public record, preserved simultaneously in memory, observation, and digital form, ensuring that its outcome would extend far beyond the physical space in which it occurred. A final transition unfolded across the civic plaza not through any single dramatic action, but through the complete consolidation of observation, documentation, and consequence into a unified public record that no longer belonged to the immediate participants alone. Officer Daniel Brooks stood at the base of the municipal steps, his posture still structured and controlled, yet the subtle stillness in his stance now reflected the weight of sustained external attention that had expanded far beyond the physical boundaries of the scene. Around him, the crowd remained steady, phones still raised, faces focused, but the energy had shifted from anticipation to resolution, as if everyone present understood that the moment they were witnessing had already reached its irreversible point. Alicia Carter remained composed at the center of the space, her expression calm and steady, holding her folder with the same grounded presence that had defined her throughout the entire sequence, her calm now standing in quiet contrast to the fully transformed environment around her. The second officer maintained position slightly behind Brooks, scanning the perimeter with controlled precision, but the overall scene no longer suggested escalation or uncertainty, only observation and aftermath. Within the crowd, multiple devices continued recording, but the motion had slowed, becoming more stable and deliberate, signaling that the act of documentation had transitioned from active capture to completed preservation. Officer Brooks no longer spoke continuously, instead, his presence was marked by extended pauses that reflected the weight of awareness that the interaction was now fully exposed to interpretation beyond the plaza. Alicia's gaze remained steady, occasionally shifting across the observers without reaction, her composure reinforcing the quiet stability that defined the final stage of the encounter. The civic building behind them remained unchanged, its reflective surfaces capturing fragments of the scene in softened light, as if the environment itself was absorbing the conclusion of what had unfolded beneath it. A subtle shift passed through the outer edge of the crowd as a few individuals lowered their phones slightly, indicating that recording had concluded for some, while others held their devices a moment longer before following suit. The collective silence persisted, but it had transformed into something final and reflective rather than anticipatory. Officer Brooks adjusted his stance one last time, a controlled movement that now carried the tone of closure rather than authority assertion. Alicia remained still, her presence unchanged, embodying a sense of resolution that required no further confirmation. The second officer maintained position, but his scanning motion had slowed, signaling that the operational awareness of the moment had transitioned into post-event observation. Without any additional escalation or exchange, the interaction reached its natural conclusion, defined not by words or actions in its final seconds, but by the complete shift of the plaza from active confrontation into documented history. What remained was silence, steady and uninterrupted, marking the end of a public moment that had already moved beyond its physical space and into lasting record.